It started like any other casual fling, a typical modern dating story born out of boredom and the swipe of a thumb. Let me tell you about my friend who had her first, and last, date with the guy she met on Tinder. She was a bartender at a busy spot in our city, the kind of place that was always packed on weekends and kept her pockets full of tips. Let's call her Sarah. She was sharp, funny, and independent, the type of person you'd assume could see through anyone's nonsense. She didn't need anyone to take care of her. She had that covered. Maybe that's why she didn't think twice when she met this guy. His profile was unremarkable, just normal enough to put her at ease. Handsome in a forgettable way, polite but not overly eager. He seemed safe. The date itself was uneventful, she told me later. Drinks at a local dive bar, nothing too fancy. He was charming, funny, and attentive, the kind of guy who asked her questions and actually seemed to listen. They didn't talk about anything too deep, just the kind of casual chatter that comes with getting to know someone new. When he suggested heading back to her place, it didn't feel like a big deal. She was an adult, and she made adult decisions. The next morning, he was gone before she even woke up. He'd left a quick text, something generic like, "Thanks for last night, smiley face." But that was it. She wasn't offended. In fact, she barely thought about him again. It was just another one-night stand, and she moved on with her week. Then, a few days later, something strange happened. She was at the grocery store, trying to pay for a carton of milk and some bread, when her debit card got declined. At first, she thought it was just a glitch. Maybe the system was down, or maybe she'd grabbed the wrong card. But when she checked her banking app later, her heart sank. Her account was nearly empty. Hundreds of dollars were gone, spent on things she didn't recognize. There were charges from Best Buy, Grubhub, and a few other stores she hadn't visited in years. It didn't make sense. She immediately went into problem-solving mode. As a bartender, Sarah was good about saving money and keeping her finances in check. She couldn't remember the last time her account had dipped below a comfortable balance, let alone been drained like this. Her first thought was that her card must have been stolen or cloned. But as she racked her brain, she realized something unsettling. The only person who'd had access to her wallet recently was him. Her pulse quickened as she remembered how he'd been alone in her apartment for a few minutes while she'd gone to the bathroom. Could he have taken pictures of her cards? Memorized her numbers? The thought sent a chill down her spine. But it got worse. Out of morbid curiosity, she checked her credit card account, even though she rarely used it. Sure enough, there were charges there too. They weren't for big-ticket items like electronics or food delivery. Instead, they were subscriptions, streaming services she didn't use. Netflix, Hulu, Sling, Amazon Prime. The guy hadn't just stolen her money. He'd stolen pieces of her identity, embedding himself into her life in a way she wouldn't have noticed for weeks if she hadn't checked. She was furious. She opened Tinder to confront him, but his profile was gone. Deleted. It was like he'd vanished into thin air, leaving her with nothing but a growing list of fraudulent charges. She felt helpless, angry, and embarrassed all at once. How could she have been so trusting? So careless? But Sarah wasn't the type to sit back and accept defeat. She remembered they had a mutual friend on Facebook, a co-worker of hers who'd mentioned knowing him briefly. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. She reached out, carefully explaining the situation without diving into too many personal details. "Do you know anything about this guy?" she asked, hoping for some clue that might help her track him down. The response came quickly, and it stopped her cold. "Oh my God," the friend wrote. "He did the exact same thing to me." It was like déjà vu. The friend described meeting him on Tinder, going on a date, and bringing him home. And just like with Sarah, her accounts were drained within days. The friend had been too humiliated to tell anyone about it at the time, chalking it up as a painful lesson learned. But hearing that he'd done the same thing to Sarah lit a fire under both of them. They started digging. Between the two of them, they managed to piece together a picture of who this guy really was. A serial scammer who preyed on women he met online. His MO was always the same. Charm his way into their lives, steal their financial information while they weren't looking, and then disappear before they realized what had happened. The more they uncovered, the angrier Sarah became. How many other women had he done this to? How many others hadn't even realized it yet? She filed a police report and contacted her banks, but the process was slow and frustrating. She got her cards canceled and started the long, tedious task of disputing the charges, but the emotional toll was harder to shake. "I felt violated," she told me. "Not just because he stole from me, but because I let him into my home. I trusted him enough to fall asleep next to him, and he used that trust to screw me over." Even now, Sarah says the experience has changed the way she approaches dating. She doesn't trust easily anymore, and she's hyper-aware of who she lets into her space. She double-checks her locks, keeps her wallet out of sight, and never leaves a stranger alone in her apartment. It's exhausting, she admits, but it's the only way she feels safe. The story stuck with me for days after she told me. It wasn't just about a bad date. It was a reminder of how easily we can fall victim to someone who knows exactly how to exploit our vulnerabilities. In the age of dating apps, where we swipe through potential matches like we're ordering from a menu, it's easy to forget that not everyone is who they claim to be. Sarah's story is a cautionary tale, one I share with people whenever the topic of online dating comes up. Not because I want to scare them, but because I want them to be careful, to trust their instincts, to remember that even the most charming stranger can have a darker side. So, the next time you match with someone who seems too good to be true, take a moment to think about Sarah. And maybe, just maybe, keep your wallet locked away. It started like every other hopeful swipe through the dating app. His profile seemed normal, attractive enough, witty, with a bio that read like he had both a sense of humor and a steady job. I wasn't expecting fireworks or a soulmate. I just wanted a pleasant evening out with someone who wouldn't make me regret shaving my legs. What I got was something so bizarre, so mortifying, that even years later, the memory still makes me cringe. The horror began the moment he sent me the location for our date. "Great little Italian place," he texted. Perfect, I thought. Italian food is romantic and safe. Who doesn't love pasta? But then he added, "Oh, and I hope you don't mind, my mom's tagging along." At first, I thought he was joking. His mom? Surely, this was some sort of millennial humor I didn't understand. But no. He quickly clarified, "Yeah, we're a package deal. She'll be there with her OkCupid date. It'll be fun." Fun. That was the word he used. Fun. As if this was some quirky sitcom setup, and not the giant red flag it clearly was. I should have bailed right then and there. I should have ghosted him, blocked his number, and deleted the app entirely. But against my better judgment, and probably because I'd already picked out an outfit, I decided to go. I told myself it couldn't possibly be as bad as it sounded. Oh, how wrong I was. I arrived at the restaurant a few minutes early, hoping to calm my nerves with a glass of wine before the weirdness began. But there they were, already seated at a booth in the back, waving me over like this was some sort of family reunion. Him, his mom, and a middle-aged man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Hey," he said, standing up to greet me. His enthusiasm was unsettling. He hugged me as if we were old friends, and then, with no warning, introduced his mom. "This is Carol, my mom," he said proudly, as if I were meeting the Queen of England. She stood and pulled me into an equally enthusiastic hug. "And this," she said, gesturing to the man sitting awkwardly beside her, "is Gary. We met online last week. Isn't he great?" I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Gary barely made eye contact, mumbling something about how nice it was to meet me. He looked like he was mentally plotting his escape, and for a moment, I envied him. At least he had the excuse of being Carol's date. I, on the other hand, had willingly walked into this nightmare. "Let's sit down," my date said cheerfully, oblivious to the absolute chaos he'd orchestrated. I slid into the booth, squished awkwardly between him and the wall, while his mom and Gary sat across from us. The waiter came by to take drink orders, and before I could even glance at the menu, Carol announced that we should all do tequila shots to break the ice. I wanted to crawl under the table. Gary looked like he wanted to too, but my date was all in. "Great idea, Mom," he said, high-fiving her like this was spring break in Cancun. I reluctantly ordered a glass of wine, hoping it would take the edge off whatever fresh hell was unfolding before me. The conversation started innocently enough, though Carol dominated it entirely. She talked about her job, her dog, her latest trip to Sedona, and how spiritual the energy there was. Gary nodded along dutifully, clearly uninterested but too polite to interrupt. My date, meanwhile, chimed in with random anecdotes about his childhood, as if his mom needed any reminders of the time he broke his arm trying to skateboard off the roof. I tried to steer the conversation toward something normal, hobbies, movies, anything that didn't involve family dynamics, but it was like shouting into the void. Every time I asked my date a question, Carol would jump in with her own answer. "He loves hiking," she said at one point, cutting him off mid-sentence. "But he's terrible at it. Remember when you got lost on Camelback Mountain? We had to send a search party." He laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. I forced a polite smile, trying to figure out how quickly I could eat my meal and leave without seeming rude. Then came the food. Or more accurately, the food fight. Carol decided it would be cute to feed Gary a bite of her spaghetti, but he flinched, and the fork ended up poking him in the chin. Sauce splattered everywhere, and instead of apologizing, she burst out laughing, dabbing at his face with her napkin like he was a toddler who'd made a mess. "Isn't he adorable?" she cooed, while Gary stared blankly at his plate, his soul visibly leaving his body. By this point, I was seriously considering faking a phone call or claiming I had an early morning meeting. But my date seemed completely unfazed by the absurdity of it all. "This is going great, isn't it?" he whispered to me, leaning in like we were sharing some intimate moment. I stared at him, wondering if he was actually delusional or just painfully unaware of social norms. Things took a turn for the truly unbearable when Carol decided it was time for karaoke. Yes, karaoke. In the middle of a crowded Italian restaurant with no actual karaoke setup. She stood up, grabbed a spoon as a makeshift microphone, and launched into an off-key rendition of Don't Stop Believin'. Gary tried to stop her, but she was unstoppable. My date clapped along enthusiastically, as if this was the peak of entertainment. I was mortified. People were staring. The waiter looked like he wanted to intervene, but wasn't sure how to approach a woman belting out Journey lyrics over plates of fettuccine. I prayed for the ground to open up and swallow me whole. Finally, mercifully, the check arrived. Carol insisted on paying, declaring that it was her treat since she'd had such a fabulous time. Gary mumbled something about needing to use the restroom and never came back. I envied his bravery. As we walked out of the restaurant, my date turned to me beaming. "So," he said, "when can I see you again?" I blinked at him, unsure whether to laugh or scream. "You're joking, right?" I said, unable to hide my incredulity. He looked genuinely confused. "What do you mean?" "Tonight was amazing." "Amazing." That was the word he used. "Amazing." I managed a polite smile, mumbled something about being busy, and practically sprinted to my car. The moment I got home, I deleted his number, blocked him on the dating app, and poured myself a very large glass of wine. There was no way I was ever putting myself through something like that again. A first date is supposed to be about getting to know someone, not surviving a double date with their mom and her OkCupid disaster. Looking back, I still can't believe I didn't run the second he mentioned Carol. It's become one of those stories I tell at parties, the kind that makes everyone gasp and laugh in disbelief. But at the time, it was pure, unfiltered horror. I matched with this insanely attractive girl on Tinder, seriously way out of my league. She had this sultry look in her photos, the kind that makes you wonder if she even needs to be on a dating app at all. Her bio was short but intriguing, something about loving a little danger and late-night drives. It was the kind of profile that makes your heart race as you swipe right, hoping against hope she'll swipe right too. And then she did. We started chatting, and I couldn't believe how easy it was. She was flirty right off the bat, no awkward small talk or "what do you do for work" nonsense. It was like she had read my mind and knew exactly how to keep me hooked. Within hours, the conversation turned steamy, texts that would make your phone overheat, if you know what I mean. It was bold, direct, and exactly the kind of adrenaline rush I didn't know I needed. By the end of the day, we were sexting. Not just a little playful innuendo, but full-on, no-holds-barred, X-rated stuff. She was imaginative, confident, and every word she typed made my heart pound a little harder. I remember sitting there, grinning like an idiot, thinking, this is it. This is what people dream about when they join these apps. Then she hit me with something unexpected. "You're fun," she texted. "I have to tell you something, though. Don't freak out." I froze for a second. 1,000 scenarios ran through my head. Was she about to say she had a boyfriend? That she wasn't really single? That she lived halfway across the country? Whatever it was, I figured I could roll with it. I mean, we were having fun, and I was already hooked. "What is it?" I replied, trying to sound as casual as possible. There was a pause. 3 dots danced on the screen for what felt like forever before her next message popped up. "I'm actually a guy. LOL." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My brain short-circuited. I stared at my phone, half expecting her to follow up with a "just kidding" or some kind of explanation. But nothing came. Just silence. It was like my world tilted sideways for a moment. Here I was, completely caught up in this wild, flirty exchange, only to find out it had all been some kind of twisted joke. My cheeks burned with embarrassment. My heart raced for a completely different reason now. The confidence I'd been feeling all day, gone, completely obliterated. My initial reaction was a mix of anger and humiliation. I felt played, like I'd been dragged into some weird prank for someone else's amusement. But then, as I reread the message, another feeling started to creep in, defiance. "Joke's on you," I typed back. "I'm bi." I hit send, and for a moment, I just stared at the screen, waiting to see what would happen next. Would he keep the joke going? Try to backpedal? Apologize? I wasn't sure what I wanted. Maybe a little validation that I hadn't completely wasted my time. Maybe just a way to salvage my pride. Instead, the guy unmatched me. Just like that, the chat disappeared, taking all the steamy messages and the bizarre twist with it. It was like it had never happened, except for the lingering mix of emotions swirling in my chest. Anger, confusion, a tiny bit of amusement, all rolled into one. I sat there, staring at the blank Tinder screen, trying to process what the hell had just happened. I should have been furious. And don't get me wrong, part of me definitely was. No one likes being tricked or humiliated, especially not in such a personal way. But at the same time, I couldn't help but laugh. The sheer absurdity of it all was too much. I'd gone from thinking I was living out some kind of fantasy to being the punchline of a random dude's trolling escapade. The thing is, the more I thought about it, the less it bothered me. Sure, it was a weird experience, and yeah, I felt a little dumb for falling for it. His profile hadn't exactly wowed me, but he seemed nice enough in our messages, decent, funny in a mildly awkward way, and insistent that we should meet in person because chemistry is better face to face. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Maybe I was too cynical, I thought. Maybe this could be a surprise, the kind of date that blossoms into something when you least expect it. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. When I arrived at the bar, he was already there. Not just sitting, but halfway through his second pitcher of beer. That should have been my first clue to bail, but he didn't seem drunk. In fact, he seemed completely sober, which only made the sheer amount of alcohol in front of him more unnerving. He stood to greet me, flashed an awkward smile, and offered a clumsy compliment about my outfit. Something about him felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. We started talking, and at first it wasn't awful. He was polite, engaged, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. But the more we talked, the clearer it became that we had absolutely nothing in common. His stories felt flat, his jokes didn't land, and every time I tried to steer the conversation towards something more interesting, it fizzled out like a dud firecracker. Still, I stuck it out, telling myself not to judge too quickly. Then came the turning point. I was ready to wrap up the evening. He wasn't rude or offensive, just not my type. But when I mentioned heading out, he practically begged me to stay. "Come on, let's hit one more bar." "Just one drink," he said, his tone teetering on desperate. I hesitated. It was only 8 p.m., and the thought of cutting the night short made me feel unreasonably guilty. Against my instincts, I agreed. The next bar was smaller, darker, and more crowded. We found 2 seats at the bar, squeezed between a boisterous group of friends and a couple who were practically swallowing each other whole. I could feel his eyes on me as I ordered a drink, but it wasn't the kind of gaze that makes you feel flattered. It was intense, calculating, like he was trying to read something beneath the surface. As the couple next to us continued their public display of affection, he leaned in close and asked, "What do you think people here would do if we started making out?" I froze. My gut reaction was to laugh it off, make some joke to defuse the tension. "Probably nothing," I said. "People are too busy with their own drama." But he wasn't joking. His expression didn't shift, and his eyes didn't leave mine. "We should try it," he said. I let out a nervous laugh, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "I don't think that's a great idea," I said, keeping my tone light. "Not really my thing." I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to regroup and figure out how to exit this increasingly uncomfortable situation. When I returned, he had ordered a shot for me. Just one shot, none for himself. He slid it across the bar with a wide grin, insisting I drink it. "It's on me," he said, his voice oozing with false charm. "I'm good, thanks," I replied, trying to sound polite but firm. His demeanor shifted instantly. The grin vanished, replaced by a sharp edge of irritation. "Come on," he snapped. "It's just one shot." "No, really." "I'm fine," I repeated. His jaw tightened, and he let out a frustrated sigh before muttering, "Whatever. I'm ready to go." By that point, I was more than ready to leave too. But something about his behavior stuck with me. The man had consumed 2 pitchers of beer for margaritas and 2 pints of beer, and yet he displayed zero signs of intoxication. Not a single stumble, slur, or lapse in coordination. The sheer volume of alcohol alone was staggering, but the way he carried himself made it even more unsettling. As we walked outside, I hesitated. "Are you sure you're okay to drive?" I asked, genuinely concerned. He whipped his head toward me, his expression darkening. "I'm fine," he snapped, his voice dripping with defensiveness. "I can handle my liquor." Without waiting for a response, he stalked off in the opposite direction, disappearing into the night. When I got home, the evening still gnawed at me. Despite how bizarre and uncomfortable it had been, a part of me couldn't shake the worry that something might happen to him on the road. Maybe it was foolish, but I decided to text him, just to make sure he got home safely. His response came quickly, and it hit me like a slap in the face. "I only date girls I fuck on the first date." I stared at my phone, my mind racing between shock, anger, and disgust. The sheer audacity of that message, after everything else he'd said and done, left me speechless. Any lingering guilt or concern I'd felt evaporated instantly. He wasn't just a bad date, he was a walking red flag factory, churning out warning signs faster than I could process them. Looking back, I realize how many moments I ignored my instincts. The way he guzzled beer without showing any effects. The forced charm. The uncomfortable questions and the single, suspiciously targeted shot. It all screamed trouble, but I brushed it off, telling myself I was overreacting. I wasn't. That night taught me a valuable lesson about trusting my gut. Sometimes we ignore the warning signs because we want to believe the best in people. We convince ourselves to stay a little longer, give someone another chance, even when every fiber of our being is telling us to leave. But not everyone deserves that chance. Some people are exactly who they show you they are, right from the start. Dodging that bullet wasn't just luck, it was a wake-up call. And trust me, I'm listening now. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just a nice distraction, maybe a fun conversation over drinks. I'd matched with this guy on Tinder a few days earlier. He was older, 43, but that didn't bother me. His profile gave off the kind of energy that suggested he was confident, but not cocky, someone who might actually have their life together. He was funny, complimentary in our messages, and seemed genuinely excited to meet me. Against my better judgment, I decided to take a chance. We agreed to meet around 3 p.m., the safe territory of daylight. When I arrived, he was already waiting outside, smiling and waving like we'd known each other forever. His energy was infectious. He cracked a joke right away, and I found myself laughing, my nerves starting to ease. The first hitch came almost immediately. The restaurant we planned to visit had a line snaking out the door. He shrugged it off and suggested we go somewhere nearby, a charming spot on the water he claimed to love. "Perfect for a first date," he said, flashing me a grin that felt disarming. I agreed, not realizing then just how wrong he was. The place was beautiful, umbrellas shading tables overlooking the harbor, sunlight glinting off the waves. I thought, maybe this won't be so bad. We grabbed a table, ordered drinks, and started talking. He was funny, I'll give him that. Witty enough to keep the conversation flowing, complimentary enough to make me feel flattered, but not overwhelmed. He seemed like he had it all together, until the Mai Tais arrived. I ordered one, just to be polite, but he immediately went for two. "They're my favorite," he said, raising his glass in a toast. "You haven't lived until you've tried a real Mai Tai." He wasn't kidding about their strength. Halfway through mine, I could feel the alcohol creeping up on me. I wasn't drunk, but I was definitely tipsy, maybe even bordering on drunk if I'd finished the whole thing. Meanwhile, he polished off his first Mai Tai like it was water and waved down the bartender for a second. By the time I finished my drink, he was already on his third. It wasn't long before his demeanor started to change. What had been light-hearted and charming turned intense. He leaned across the table, eyes locked on mine, and said, "You're amazing, you know that? I think I'm falling in love with you." I laughed, assuming he was joking. "We just met," I said, trying to keep things light. "No, I'm serious," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're everything I've been looking for." The words felt like a slap. I didn't know how to respond. It was way too much, too soon. I tried to steer the conversation back to something neutral, but he kept circling back to the same theme. How perfect I was, how he couldn't believe he'd found me, how he thought this might be fate. By the time we left the restaurant, he was visibly drunk. Not stumbling, but there was a glassy look in his eyes, and his words slurred just enough to make me uneasy. As we walked along the street, he suddenly stopped, turned to me, and said, "Marry me." I froze. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, dead serious. Why wait? When you know. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe we take it slow. We did just meet each other. But he didn't laugh. His face darkened, and his whole body tensed. Take it slow, he snapped. What does that even mean? I thought you felt the same way. I mean, I like you, but we've only known each other for a couple of hours. He didn't respond. Instead, he stormed off, leaving me standing on a street corner, stunned. I watched as he disappeared into the crowd, my heart pounding with a mix of relief and disbelief. Part of me wanted to call him back just to make sure he wasn't about to wander into traffic, but the bigger part of me knew I needed to cut ties, and fast. I stood there for a minute, trying to process what had just happened. This guy had gone from charming to overbearing to downright hostile in the span of 2 hours. I felt like I'd been on a roller coaster I never wanted to board in the first place. By the time I got home, I thought I was done with him. I'd made up my mind to block his number and move on. But then the text started. Come over. I miss you. It was 5 p.m. The date had only ended an hour ago, and this man, this 43-year-old man, was texting me like a lovesick teenager. Each message felt more unhinged than the last. I didn't respond, but they kept coming, a relentless barrage of desperation that made my skin crawl. I sat there, staring at my phone, wondering how I'd managed to end up in this situation. It wasn't just the absurdity of his behavior. It was the way he had seemed so normal at first. So charming, so composed. And then, like a switch had flipped, he became someone else entirely. Someone I didn't recognize. Someone I didn't want to be anywhere near. Looking back, I can see all the red flags I ignored. The way he slammed down drinks without hesitation. The way he insisted on a third Mai Tai, even though the bar had a 2-drink limit. The way his compliments felt just a little too intense, a little too rehearsed. But at the time, I brushed them off, telling myself I was overreacting. It was supposed to be a simple coffee date. Just a casual meeting to see if this girl I'd been chatting with for a couple of days was as interesting in person as she was online. Her messages had been fun and flirty, and although I wasn't expecting fireworks, I thought it might be worth a shot. But instead, what started as a hopeful afternoon turned into one of the creepiest and most unsettling experiences of my life. To this day, the memory of it sends a chill down my spine. We'd agreed to meet at a little coffee shop downtown, the kind of cozy spot with mismatched furniture and overpriced lattes. She'd suggested it, saying it was her favorite place to hang out and that they made the best chai tea. I thought it was charming how specific she was about her drink order. Something about it made her seem more real, more grounded. That, paired with her quirky sense of humor in our chats, had convinced me to step outside my comfort zone and say yes to meeting up so quickly. I arrived a few minutes early, scanning the room for a face I recognized from her profile pictures. She wasn't there yet, so I grabbed a seat by the window, ordered a coffee, and waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I figured she was running late, which was fine, it happens. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to feel a little uneasy. I pulled out my phone and sent her a quick text. Hey, just wanted to check. Are you on your way? The response came almost immediately. Oh, I'm here. Been here for a while, actually. I looked around the cafe, feeling a wave of confusion. I hadn't seen anyone who even remotely resembled her pictures. I typed back, I don't see you, where are you sitting? Her reply made my stomach drop. I'm not in the cafe. I'm outside, watching you. At first, I thought it had to be a joke. A weird, twisted attempt at being playful. But the longer I stared at the message, the more unsettled I became. I glanced out the window, scanning the street for anyone who looked like they might be waiting for someone. Nothing. Just strangers hurrying by, lost in their own lives. A what? I texted back, my heart starting to race. That's when the truth came out. The next message hit me like a punch to the gut. I'm not who you think I am. I'm a guy. I've been catfishing you. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. My mind raced, trying to process what I'd just read. I looked around again, suddenly hyper-aware of everyone around me. Was he in here, pretending to be a stranger? Was he really outside, watching me through the window? Either way, I felt exposed, like a spotlight had been turned on me, and I couldn't escape it. Before I could reply, another message came through, and this one sent a shiver down my spine. I just wanted to see you in person. You're gorgeous. It's such a shame you're a lesbian, because I'd totally do you. My hands shook as I stared at the words on my screen. The casual audacity of it made my skin crawl. He wasn't apologetic or embarrassed. He was proud of what he'd done, as though catfishing me and stalking me in public was some kind of harmless prank. I wanted to scream, to demand why he'd done this, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, my thoughts racing too fast to form words. Instead, I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, keeping my head down as I stepped onto the street. Every person I passed felt like a potential threat. Was it him? Was he following me? My heart pounded as I walked quickly to my car, resisting the urge to break into a full sprint. Once I was safely inside, I locked the doors and tried to calm myself. I still couldn't fully comprehend what had just happened. I'd heard of catfishing before, sure, but this wasn't about someone trying to scam me for money or trick me into sending nudes. This was something else entirely. He'd gone through all this effort just to stare at me? In public? The thought made my stomach churn. Later that night, when I finally worked up the nerve to check my messages again, I saw he'd sent more. Long paragraphs, full of twisted justifications for his behavior. He rambled about how he'd stumbled across my profile and been fascinated by me, how he'd created the fake profile just to get my attention. He admitted he never had any intention of meeting up in person. He just wanted to see what I was like in real life. And then came the part that really solidified the creep factor. He started criticizing me for not noticing him in the cafe. I was sitting right there, he wrote. You looked right past me. It's kind of sad, honestly. You didn't even notice. That's when it hit me. He hadn't been outside watching me through the window. He'd been in the cafe the whole time, sitting among the other patrons, pretending to be a stranger. My stomach twisted into knots as I tried to remember everyone I'd seen while I was sitting there. Was it the man in the corner with the laptop? The guy who'd been reading a book at the table next to mine? I'd been so absorbed in waiting for her that I hadn't paid attention to anyone else. The thought of him sitting there watching me dissecting my every move made my skin crawl. I felt violated in a way I hadn't even realized was possible. He'd stolen my time, my trust, and a little piece of my sense of safety, all for his own selfish amusement. I blocked him immediately, but the experience stayed with me. For days, I felt like I was being watched everywhere I went. Every glance from a stranger felt loaded, every interaction tinged with suspicion. It wasn't just the act itself that haunted me, it was the casual, almost playful way he'd gone about it, like it was a game to him, like my comfort, my boundaries, and my trust were nothing more than pawns on his chessboard. His profile had been charming enough, and when we met in person, he seemed just as easygoing. We'll call him Dude. He was tall, 6'4" to be exact, and had a laid-back demeanor that made me feel at ease. I wasn't expecting fireworks, but he was polite, funny, and surprisingly thoughtful. When the movie ended, I figured we'd call it a night, but he suggested hanging out a bit longer. Why not? I thought. He was nice enough, and besides, it was still early. What could go wrong? We headed back to my place, and I made it clear from the start, you can hang out for a bit, but I have work in the morning, so I'll need to get to sleep soon. He nodded, smiling. No problem at all. So far, so good. But then he mentioned he was hungry and asked if he could order some food. Sure, I said, not thinking much of it. He whipped out his phone and promptly ordered 2 massive subs from Potbelly and a milkshake. When the food arrived, he demolished it in minutes. I figured he was just a big guy with a big appetite, nothing unusual there. What I didn't know was how that decision would spiral into one of the most bizarre and horrifying nights of my life. After finishing his late-night feast, we ended up messing around for a bit before falling asleep in my bed. Everything seemed perfectly normal, until I was jolted awake at 1 a.m. by the sound of my front door opening and closing. Then it happened again, and again. My dogs were barking like mad, and I could feel my stomach knotting with unease. What was this guy doing? Still groggy, I got up to investigate. My bedroom door opened to the rest of my apartment, and as I stepped into the hallway, I noticed the bathroom light was on, the door wide open. Confused, I moved closer, and that's when I saw him. There he was, crouched over my toilet in the middle of the night, holding a stick. A literal stick. The water in the toilet bowl was murky and brown, teetering dangerously close to overflowing. He looked up, his face a mix of horror and embarrassment, and shouted, "Stop looking at me. Go back to bed. I've got it under control." I froze, my half-asleep brain struggling to process the scene before me. "What are you doing?" I managed to stammer, but he was having none of it. "Why don't you have a plunger?" he yelled, as if I were the one in the wrong. "I don't know." I shot back, equal parts confused and incredulous. "I've never needed one until now." He waved me away like a parent trying to shoo a child. Go back to bed. I've got this. I couldn't decide whether to laugh, scream, or cry. In the end, my tiredness won out. With a nervous chuckle that barely masked my discomfort, I muttered something incoherent and went back to bed, leaving him to his chaotic toilet battle. A short while later, I heard him peek into my room. His voice was calm, almost triumphant. I fixed it. And then, just like that, he was gone. I heard the door close behind him, and silence settled over the apartment once more. The next morning, I hesitated before approaching the bathroom. Part of me wanted to pretend the whole thing had been a weird, sleep-deprived dream. But as I peeked inside, reality hit me like a freight train. The water level in the toilet had gone down, but something was still sticking out from the bottom of the bowl. Squinting, I realized it was the tip of a stick. Feeling a mix of dread and determination, I armed myself with gloves, towels, and a pair of barbecue tongs. Bracing myself, I pulled on the stick and kept pulling. It didn't end. What emerged from my toilet was a 3-foot-long branch, broken and splintered in places, followed by several more fragments of wood. I stood there, horrified, as the full picture came together. That sound I'd heard, the door opening and closing repeatedly, it was him going outside to hunt for sticks, trying to find one sturdy enough to fix the mess he'd made. One stick after another had snapped under the pressure, forcing him to venture out again and again. And the results? Drippy, muddy water stains all over my bathroom floor. But the nightmare didn't end there. As I surveyed the damage, I noticed something else. He'd left behind his underwear, undershirt, and socks. He had fled my apartment so fast, he hadn't even bothered to collect all his belongings. I stood there in stunned silence, staring at the evidence of his midnight catastrophe. I had so many questions. Why didn't he just ask me for help? Why didn't he call it a night before ordering enough food to sink the Titanic? And most of all, why didn't I own a plunger? After work that day, I went straight to the store and bought one. I didn't care that I'd never needed one before. I wasn't about to go through anything like that again. Lesson learned. I'll never forget the day my dad sat me down and told me this story. The sheer absurdity of it has haunted and amused me ever since. It started as a light-hearted conversation, the kind where you swap funny anecdotes about life and dating, but by the end, I was left staring at him in stunned disbelief, trying to decide whether to laugh or question humanity itself. Let me set the stage for you. My dad, a tall, decent-looking Australian man in his early 50s, had recently decided to dip his toes into the world of online dating. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd see him doing, but after my mom passed away, he'd spent a long time on his own. He wasn't looking for anything serious, just companionship, someone to grab dinner with or share a few laughs. Tinder, he figured, was a modern way to meet people. Little did he know, it was also a gateway into the bizarre. For the first few months, things went relatively well. He matched with a handful of women, went on some pleasant dates, and even made a few friends. He'd tell me about the conversations and how strange some profiles were, but overall, he was enjoying himself. That is, until one weekend when his Tinder experience took a turn for the spicy. It started with a notification, a new message from a woman he'd matched with a few days earlier. She wasn't someone he'd been particularly interested in, but he'd swiped right out of politeness. She was persistent, messaging him often, though her responses were a bit offbeat, to say the least. He chalked it up to her quirky sense of humor and didn't think much of it. Then out of the blue, she sent him a photo. The first thing that struck him wasn't the content itself, but the timing. It was mid-afternoon on a Saturday. Who sends a nude at 2 p.m.? He opened the message cautiously, half expecting it to be a funny meme or a picture of her dog. But no, it was exactly what you're imagining. A full-on, no-holds-barred nude shot. My dad, being the kind of man who rarely lets things faze him, simply raised an eyebrow and muttered, "Well, that's strange," before brushing it off. He didn't respond, figuring she'd take the hint. But over the next few days, she doubled down. 5 more photos landed in his inbox, each one more explicit than the last. "Why didn't you block her after the first one?" I asked him, incredulous. He shrugged. I thought maybe she'd get bored. And I was curious. People are weird. I wanted to see how far she'd go. He decided to open the rest of the pictures, if only for the sheer absurdity of it all. The first 5 were, as he described them, vague shots with terrible lighting. He made a face as he recounted them, clearly unimpressed. "They looked like she'd taken them in a basement," he said, shaking his head. "No effort. No artistry. But it was the sixth photo that truly cemented this story as the strangest Tinder experience of his life. At first glance, the picture seemed similar to the others, a full-body mirror selfie with the same lackluster lighting. But as his eyes adjusted to the details, he realized something was very, very wrong. The woman was standing there in her bra, everything else exposed, but tucked into her bra were herbs. Not metaphorical herbs. Literal sprigs of basil, parsley, thyme, and who knows what else. She was posing confidently, one hand on her hip, a smirk on her face, and winking at the camera like she'd just delivered the punchline to the world's greatest joke. And the caption? Oh, the caption. It read, "Spice Rack." My dad burst out laughing as he told me this part of the story, tears streaming down his face. I couldn't believe it, he said, gasping for air. I just sat there, staring at my phone, thinking, this is where we are now. This is what dating has become. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I should be horrified or impressed by her audacity. What did you do? I asked, bracing myself for his response. Well, he said, still chuckling. I laughed so hard I had to put my phone down. Once I stopped crying, I realized I had no choice but to block her. I mean, what else can you do? She called herself a spice rack. The image he painted in my mind was impossible to shake. The sheer confidence it must have taken to not only create that moment, but to send it to another person, a person she barely knew, was both astonishing and deeply unsettling. My dad, to his credit, handled the situation better than most people would have. Instead of being angry or offended, he chose to see the humor in it. But it left him questioning whether Tinder was truly the best way to meet people. I still don't get it, he said, shaking his head. Was she trying to be funny? Sexy? Both. Whatever it wasn't working. The story quickly became a legend among our family and friends. Every time he'd retell it, he'd emphasize the absurdity of it all, mimicking her pose and delivering the spice rack punchline with perfect timing. But beneath the humor, there was a layer of caution. It's a strange world out there, he told me one day. You never know what you're going to get. People are unpredictable. Some will surprise you in good ways, others, well, they'll show you their spice rack. We laughed, but his words stuck with me. His experience, while bizarre and hilarious, was a reminder of how surreal online dating can be. People present themselves in ways they'd never dream of doing in real life, pushing boundaries and testing limits, often with no regard for how the person on the receiving end might feel. As for my dad, he stayed on Tinder a little while longer, though he was much more selective about who he matched with. A girl I'd matched with on Tinder. She described it as a work party, which sounded strange at first, but she said it was laid back and suggested I bring my own beer. At 21, I wasn't new to the world of odd social gatherings and the promise of meeting new people, and maybe spending some one-on-one time with her seemed worth the gamble. I stopped by a store on the way, grabbed a six-pack, and headed over to her place. I expected some light chatter, maybe some music, and the usual awkward introductions. Instead, I walked into what I can only describe as a living room full of underage strangers and an atmosphere that felt off. The first thing I noticed was that most of the people there looked really young, 17 or 18 at most. I was immediately uneasy. The girl I was meeting was my age, so I assumed her friends would be too. But something about the way they all hovered around the room in nervous clusters made me feel out of place, like I'd walked into the wrong house. Before I could turn around and leave, the girl spotted me, waved me over, and introduced me to a few people. She seemed genuinely happy I'd come, so I figured I'd stay for a bit. After all, I had my beer, and how bad could it be? It didn't take long for the vibe to shift. A man walked into the room, commanding everyone's attention without even saying a word. He was older, maybe in his late 30s, and dressed like someone who'd just stepped off the set of a knockoff Wall Street movie. Slick back hair, too tight button-up, and shiny shoes that clicked loudly against the floor. Without much ceremony, he gathered everyone in the living room, clapping his hands and urging us to sit. The girl I'd come to meet smiled at me and gestured for me to follow, so I took a seat near the back with my beer in hand. What followed was not a party. It was a pitch, a 2-hour-long, painfully drawn-out pitch for a pyramid scheme. The man introduced himself as the head of the group and launched into what I can only describe as a rehearsed, overly enthusiastic monologue about how we could all be millionaires if we followed his proven system. He pointed out the shiny BMW parked out front, claiming it was a company car that could be ours if we signed up. His tone was so confident, so matter-of-fact, that I could almost see why someone desperate for a break might believe him. Almost. The stories began next, people in the group taking turns to share their supposed journeys of hardship and success. A young woman described how she dropped out of college because she couldn't afford tuition, but now earned more than her professors ever would. A guy who couldn't have been older than 19 talked about paying off his parents' debts with the money he'd made. They spoke in reverent tones about the head of the group, like he was some kind of savior who'd swooped in and transformed their lives. All the while, I sat there sipping my beer, the only one drinking, and trying not to let my disbelief show. The more they talked, the more I realized who their real targets were: low-income teens, fresh out of high school and uncertain about their futures. They were dangling the promise of financial independence and flashy cars in front of kids who didn't know better. It was predatory, and it made my stomach churn. At one point, the head of the group turned his attention to me. "What about you?" he asked, grinning like he already had me in the bag. "What would you do with an extra $1 million?" I forced a polite smile and shrugged. "Haven't thought about it much." He nodded knowingly, as though he'd just heard the answer he expected. "Stick with us, and you'll be able to do anything you want." For 2 hours, I endured the sales pitch, feeling increasingly out of place and uncomfortable. Every so often, I'd glance at the girl I'd come to see, wondering how she could possibly buy into this. She seemed genuinely invested, clapping and cheering along with the others. It was like watching a cult in action. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the pitch ended. People began milling around, buzzing with excitement and congratulating one another as though they'd just signed $1 million contracts. I was preparing to leave when the girl approached me. "So," she asked eagerly, "what did you think?" I hesitated, not wanting to be rude. "It's not for me," I said carefully. "But thanks for inviting me." Her face fell, but she quickly recovered. "Are you sure? It's such an amazing opportunity." "Yeah, I'm sure. But thanks." I glanced at my 6-pack, only 2 beers missing. "You guys can keep the rest. Looks like you need it more than I do." I thought that was the end of it. I thought I could leave the strangeness of the evening behind me and chalk it up as a bizarre one-time experience. But a couple of weeks later, I got a text from the girl. "Hey, I was wondering if the head of the group could call you to talk about why you're not interested. He really values feedback." I didn't respond. I thought ignoring it would be enough, but sure enough, the man himself called me a few hours later. I answered out of habit, not realizing it was him until he launched into his pitch all over again. I tried to be polite, explaining that I wasn't interested, but he wouldn't let up. He kept pushing, insisting I didn't understand the potential I was walking away from. Finally, I'd had enough. "Listen," I said firmly. "It's not for me. Stop calling me." He tried to get in one last word, but I hung up before he could finish. And that was the last I heard from him, or the girl. I'd matched with her on Tinder, a smart, funny, and genuinely interesting woman who agreed to meet me for lunch at a Cajun spot in Dallas. I wanted to make a good impression, of course, but I had an idea that would supposedly guarantee I'd be calm, confident, and carefree. That idea? Kratom. I'd read about it recently. This powdery green substance that people swore by for its mood-enhancing, euphoric effects. It was supposed to help with anxiety, make you feel chill and open. I'd tried it the day before, following the recommended dosage by making a tea, but nothing had happened. No euphoria, no calm, nothing. So naturally, I assumed the solution was to take more. The morning of the date, I went all in. No messing with teas or careful measurements this time. Instead, I wrapped a lot of the bitter green powder in slices of deli meat, making little kratom bombs, and swallowed them whole. It wasn't the most appetizing breakfast, but I figured it'd be worth it when I strolled into the restaurant as the most laid-back version of myself she'd ever meet. When I arrived at Rizzu's, I felt fine. Maybe a little nervous, but nothing out of the ordinary. I spotted her almost immediately. She was sitting at a table, smiling as she scrolled through her phone. She looked even better in person, which only added to the pressure I'd placed on myself. I took a deep breath, straightened my shirt, and walked over. We exchanged greetings, and I sat down, doing my best to seem cool and collected. The conversation started flowing, and I felt like things were off to a good start. But then something shifted. A strange, uneasy feeling began bubbling in my stomach, growing more intense with each passing moment. At first, I thought it was nerves, but as the seconds ticked by, I realized the truth. I wasn't nervous. I was about to vomit. Not just a little. This was going to be catastrophic. Panic set in. My heart raced, and my vision blurred. My stomach churned violently, and I knew I had only seconds before I became the center of the worst possible scene in the middle of the restaurant. I managed to excuse myself, mumbling something about needing to use the restroom, and stood up. My plan was simple: make it to the bathroom before disaster struck. But disaster didn't wait. I took a few steps before the first wave hit me like a freight train. I tried to cover my mouth, but it was useless. Vomit erupted, hot and relentless, spilling through my fingers as I bolted toward the bathroom. I was choking on it, my eyes watering as I sprinted, leaving a gruesome trail across the floor that no one in the restaurant could ignore. Somehow, I made it to the bathroom. Barely. The trash can just inside the door became my savior, or as much of a savior as anything could be in that moment. I doubled over, retching violently, the contents of my stomach, deli meat and kratom, spilling out with horrifying force. It felt endless. By the time I was done, I was shaking, my face pale, and my hands trembling. I leaned over the sink, splashing cold water on my face, and trying to catch my breath. My arms were streaked with vomit, my shirt stained, and my dignity completely obliterated. I scrubbed furiously, trying to make myself presentable enough to go back out there. I could only imagine what she was thinking, sitting alone at the table, probably horrified by the sound of my escape, or worse, the trail I'd left behind. I considered leaving altogether, just sneaking out the back door, disappearing into the Dallas sun, and pretending this date had never happened. But part of me felt like that would only make things worse. I couldn't leave her there with no explanation. So, against all logic, I returned to the table. When I sat down, she looked up at me, her expression a mix of concern and awkwardness. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice careful but kind. "Yeah," I croaked, my throat raw from the ordeal. "I think I ate something weird earlier. I'm so sorry about that." She nodded, and for a moment, I thought maybe I could salvage what was left of this date. But then the smell hit me. A faint, undeniable odor of bile and regret wafted from my clothes. I could see her nose twitch slightly, and I knew she noticed it too. The rest of the meal was excruciating. I tried to power through, forcing myself to eat small bites of jambalaya in between sips of water, but my appetite was gone. She made polite conversation, probably out of pity, while I focused on not throwing up again. Every second felt like an eternity, and by the time we parted ways, I was ready to crawl under a rock and never emerge. I apologized profusely as we said goodbye, thanking her for being so understanding. She smiled and said, "No worries," but I could tell the date had been a total disaster. As I walked to my car, I replayed the events over and over in my mind, cringing at every detail. Looking back, I don't know what I was thinking. The idea of using kratom to enhance my date now feels absurd, like something out of a bad comedy. I'd wanted to impress her, to show her I was cool and confident, but instead, I became the nightmare date she'd probably tell her friends about for years. For a while after that, I avoided dating altogether. She was charming, funny, and quick-witted, the kind of conversationalist who made the hours disappear. By the end of the night, we were on the phone, trading stories and laughter until the early hours. She seemed so genuine, so vibrant, that I couldn't resist asking her out for the next evening. "Sure," she said. "That sounds great." I hung up with a grin on my face, thinking I'd stumbled onto something special. But then, 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text. "I need to tell you something." Those 6 words hung in the air as I opened the message. What could it be? A boyfriend? A deal breaker? My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them prepared me for what she said next. "I'm permanently in a wheelchair." I froze. My first thought wasn't about the wheelchair itself, but the choice now in front of me. If I backed out, I'd feel like the worst kind of person, someone who couldn't look beyond a physical disability. But if I went through with the date without genuine interest, I'd feel just as awful for leading her on. Ultimately, I decided, why not? It was just a date, and if she was as great in person as she was on the phone, it could still be a good time. I texted her back, reassuring her that it wasn't a problem and that I was looking forward to meeting her. She seemed relieved, and we stayed up talking until we were both too tired to keep our eyes open. The next morning, my phone buzzed again. It was her. "I'm doing something crazy," she said, her voice buzzing with excitement. I asked what it was, but she was coy. "You'll see later," she said, before hanging up with a playful laugh. Hours passed, and I'd almost forgotten about the conversation when my phone chimed with a new message. It was a photo. I opened it, expecting something light-hearted or quirky. Instead, I stared at an image of her wrist, freshly tattooed with my name. Shock rippled through me as I tried to process what I was seeing. My name, inked permanently on the skin of a woman I'd never even met in person. I could almost feel the tattoo needle buzzing in the background as I read her accompanying text. Surprise! I called my friends immediately, telling them about the turn my date had taken before it had even started. Their reactions ranged from stunned silence to outright laughter. "You have to go now," one of them said. "You can't back out after she did that." They were right, of course. I had to know if the tattoo was real, and who this woman was who'd made such a bold, borderline terrifying move. That evening, I got in my car and headed to her place. It was late when I realized another potential issue. My car might not accommodate her wheelchair. I texted her to ask if she could drive instead, since I knew she had a car. She agreed, and I continued my drive, nerves mounting. When I arrived, she pulled into the parking lot just as I stepped out of my car. I had assumed her vehicle would be specially equipped for her needs, but when I climbed into the passenger seat, I discovered otherwise. She didn't have a handicapped-enabled car. She used crutches. One crutch operated the gas, the other the brake. The unease I'd felt earlier multiplied tenfold as we merged onto the Southern California freeways, weaving through traffic at speeds I wasn't comfortable with. She seemed calm, even cheerful, while I gripped the door handle and tried to think of anything other than the precarious mechanics of her driving. I told myself to relax, that she probably knew what she was doing. But when she sped up and the crutch wobbled slightly, I sent up a silent prayer. We made it to the restaurant in one piece. She parked the car, maneuvered herself gracefully into her wheelchair, and led the way inside. I was still on edge, but I tried to focus on enjoying the evening. For a while it worked. The food was good, the conversation easy. But then her phone rang. "It's my daughter," she said, glancing at the screen. Her daughter. This was the first I'd heard about her having a child. She answered the call, her face creasing with concern as she spoke. After hanging up, she explained that her 10-year-old daughter was home alone and feeling scared. "Do you want to go check on her?" I asked. It seemed like the obvious choice. She waved me off. "No, it's fine." I gave her something to help her sleep. "She'll be out soon." That response sent alarm bells ringing in my head, but I stayed quiet. We finished our meal, though my appetite had all but vanished, and I suggested we call it a night. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from her nonchalant attitude about leaving her child alone. On the way back, my discomfort reached a new level. As we merged back onto the freeway, she turned to me and said casually, "Wow, I feel kinda drunk." My heart stopped. "Are you okay to drive?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. She laughed. "I'm fine. It was just one drink." Then, as if to prove her point, she shifted the crutch she was using for the gas pedal, pressing it down a little harder. The car lurched forward as she moved into the fast lane. At that moment, I made peace with my life. I was convinced this was how it would end, hurtling down a California freeway in a car driven by a woman wielding crutches as pedals. Somehow, though, we made it back to her place. My nerves were shot, and all I wanted was to go home, but I made sure to help her to her door before saying goodbye. As she wheeled herself inside, she turned to smile at me one last time. "Thanks for tonight," she said. I nodded, still in shock. "Take care." The moment I got to my car, I exhaled deeply, relief washing over me like a tidal wave. The tattoo. It was real. The chaos of the evening, also real. I had survived. Driving home, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. The tattoo, the crutches, the casual dismissal of her daughter's fear, and the final revelation that she'd been drinking before getting behind the wheel. After 2 weeks of talking to him online, I felt cautiously optimistic about this date. He seemed kind, intelligent, and genuinely interested in getting to know me. There weren't any red flags during our chats, and he didn't bombard me with over-the-top compliments or invasive questions. He seemed normal, and normal was all I was looking for. When he suggested dinner, I thought, why not? After all, what's the harm in meeting someone who might actually be decent? As I stood in front of the mirror that evening, smoothing out my dress and debating whether to wear heels, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would be fun. Maybe this was someone who could surprise me in the best way. That hope began to waver almost as soon as I arrived. He was already seated when I walked into the restaurant, scrolling on his phone. I waved to get his attention, and he stood quickly, flashing a nervous smile. His appearance matched his photos, which was a relief, no surprises there. He even held my chair as I sat, a small gesture that felt reassuring. Maybe, just maybe, this would go well. The small talk started off easily enough. We discussed our weeks, shared a few anecdotes about work, and even joked about how nerve-wracking first dates could be. I felt myself beginning to relax, sipping my water and enjoying the warm, ambient lighting of the restaurant. It had been a while since I'd been out like this, and I was starting to feel glad I'd given him a chance. Then the conversation took a sharp, unexpected turn. He asked what I'd been up to recently, and I mentioned that I hadn't gone out much lately. "I've been trying to save money," I said casually. "I really need a new washer and dryer, so I'm being careful about how I spend." It felt like a harmless detail, the kind of thing you share in a conversation without expecting much of a reaction. But his response stopped me cold. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "instead of saving for that, you should save for a boob job." I blinked, stunned into silence. My mind scrambled to process what I'd just heard, replaying the words in case I'd misunderstood. But there was no mistaking them. They hung in the air, sharp and heavy, like an unwelcome guest. I didn't know what to say. Should I laugh it off? Confront him? Leave? Before I could decide, he continued, as if he'd just paid me the highest compliment in the world. "No, really," he said, his tone insistent but casual. "It's not a bad thing. My sister and mom both had small chests, and they got boob jobs. They look amazing now." My stomach twisted, a mix of disbelief and anger bubbling up inside me. Did he just say that? I stared at him, waiting for some sign that he realized how wildly inappropriate his comment was, but he seemed oblivious. If anything, he looked proud of himself, like he thought he was being helpful. I glanced around the restaurant, hoping for an escape route. The waitress hadn't even brought our drinks yet, and here I was, sitting across from a man who thought comparing me to his mother and sister was an acceptable topic of conversation on a first date. I realized in that moment that staying wasn't an option. There was no salvaging this, no amount of polite small talk that could cover the gaping wound he'd just torn into the evening. The idea of enduring even one more minute of his company made my skin crawl. I stood up, grabbing my purse. "I think I'm done here," I said, my voice as steady as I could make it. He looked up at me, confusion flickering across his face. "Wait, what? Did I say something wrong?" I didn't bother answering. There was nothing to say that he would understand. Instead, I turned and walked out of the restaurant, my heart pounding and my cheeks flushed. As I stepped into the cool night air, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had escaped, and I didn't owe him anything. Not an explanation, not a second chance, nothing. By the time I got home, I was still replaying the evening in my mind, alternating between disbelief and anger. How could someone be so oblivious? So tactless? And why, for the life of me, did he think it was appropriate to bring up plastic surgery, let alone his mom and sister's plastic surgery, on a first date? The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't about me. His comment said far more about him than it ever could about me. He had shown me in one fell swoop exactly who he was, a man who lacked basic respect, self-awareness, and decency. The experience stuck with me, not because it hurt my feelings, but because it reminded me of the importance of listening to my instincts. There was a time, not so long ago, when I might have brushed off a comment like his, staying at the table out of politeness or fear of being seen as too harsh. But not anymore. I've learned that my time and energy are too valuable to waste on people who don't see my worth. Looking back, I wish I had said more before leaving. Something clever or cutting. The kind of line you imagine in hindsight, but never managed to deliver in the moment. But maybe my silence spoke louder than any words could have. By walking away, I made it clear that his behavior was unacceptable, and that I wouldn't tolerate being treated as anything less than I deserve. It was a strange and uncomfortable night, but it wasn't a loss. If anything, it was a victory, a small but significant reminder that I have the power to remove myself from situations and people who don't serve me. And for that, I'm grateful. As for him, I can only hope he learned something from the experience. It was a first date, and I was cautiously optimistic. She seemed fun, engaging, and a little wild, qualities I found intriguing, even exciting. Her messages had been full of wit, and when we spoke on the phone, she had this electric energy that drew me in. So when she suggested meeting at a lively downtown bar, I thought, why not? It sounded like a good time, and I was ready for something a little different. She arrived just as I settled into a booth, her smile dazzling and her laugh contagious as she greeted me. We hit it off immediately, chatting over our first round of drinks. She was bold and unapologetically herself, and I found that refreshing. By the second round, we were laughing like old friends, swapping stories about our lives and joking about the absurdity of online dating. Then came the shots. A friendly guy at the bar had overheard us joking about my lack of tequila tolerance and decided to send a round of shots to our table. He came over with a grin and introduced himself. Let's call him Sam. Sam was cheerful, polite, and clearly just in the mood to spread some good vibes. He raised his glass to toast us and said, "To a fun night in good company." I thought it was a kind gesture. She, however, froze mid-sip. "Wait," she said, narrowing her eyes at Sam. "What's your zodiac sign?" Sam blinked, clearly taken aback. Scorpio." Her face darkened. "Of course you are," she muttered, setting her glass down. The warmth in her tone was gone, replaced by an edge I hadn't heard before. "Typical." I shot her a confused look. "Is that a problem?" She turned to me, her expression a mix of disbelief and indignation. "A huge problem," she said. "Scorpios are the absolute worst. You can't trust them. They're manipulative, sneaky, and they ruin everything." Sam, to his credit, laughed nervously. I'm not sure that's fair. I'm just here to have a good time." But she wasn't listening. Her focus was now squarely on me, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "You need to do something about this." "Do something about what?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Him," she hissed, jerking her head towards Sam. "You need to stand up to him. Show him he can't just walk over here and ruin our night." I stared at her, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. "He bought us shots," I pointed out. "He's just being nice." "That's how they start," she insisted, her voice growing sharper. "First they're nice. Then they worm their way in, and before you know it, they've taken over. You can't let him get away with it." I blinked at her, unsure if she was serious. "What exactly do you want me to do?" She leaned in, her eyes blazing with intensity. "You need to confront him. Start something. Let him know he can't just—" She made a vague, furious gesture. "Scorpio his way into our date." For a moment, I thought I must have misheard her. Surely, no one would seriously expect their date to pick a fight with a stranger over astrology. But as her gaze bore into mine, it became clear she wasn't joking. She wanted me to start a bar fight with Sam, the perfectly friendly guy who'd bought us drinks, simply because he was a Scorpio. I glanced over at Sam, who was now chatting with the bartender, completely oblivious to the chaos brewing at our table. "Yeah, I'm not doing that," I said firmly. Her jaw dropped. "Are you kidding me? You're just going to let him ruin our night?" "Our night is fine," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "He hasn't done anything wrong." She threw her hands up, exasperated. "This is why Scorpios always win. No one stands up to them." I sat there, stunned by the sheer absurdity of the situation. A part of me wanted to laugh, but the other part, the part that realized she was genuinely upset, was too busy processing the fact that this was happening at all. After a long, awkward silence, she grabbed her purse and stood. "If you're not going to stand up for me, then I guess this date is over." I didn't argue. She stormed out of the bar, leaving me sitting there with the shots she refused to finish, and a story I'd probably tell for the rest of my life. Sam, noticing her dramatic exit, came back over with a concerned look. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Let's just say it was a mismatch," I replied, raising my glass. "Thanks for the drinks." He smiled sympathetically and clinked his glass against mine. "Anytime, man." As I sat there sipping the tequila, I couldn't help but shake my head at how quickly the night had unraveled. I'd gone into the date with high hopes, only to end up caught in a battle I didn't even know existed, a battle against the stars themselves. We'd been chatting for 2 weeks, exchanging witty banter and thoughtful messages that seemed to flow effortlessly. She was funny, engaging, and had a way of making even the most mundane topics interesting. Eventually, she gave me her number, and our conversations only became livelier. Late at night, we'd laugh over texts, and sometimes things would take a turn toward the risque. She'd share flirty messages, even nudes, making it clear she was interested in more than just casual conversation. One night, after a particularly grueling day at work, she suggested we meet up. "Come grab a coffee with me," she said, her tone playful and persuasive. I hesitated for a moment. It was late, and she lived an hour away. But the thought of finally meeting her in person, seeing if the connection translated into real life, felt worth it. So I hopped in the car and drove. The cafe was quiet when I arrived, the kind of place that felt cozy and intimate. She was already there, waiting for me, her smile lighting up the corner of the room. For a moment, I thought This was a good decision. I grabbed a coffee, joined her at the table, and prepared for an evening of easy conversation. It didn't take long for my expectations to unravel. Barely minutes after I sat down, she launched into a monologue about her ex. At first, I thought it was just a passing comment, something she needed to get off her chest before moving on. But she didn't stop. She told me how they'd met, their highs and lows, and the many ways he'd frustrated her. Her voice was steady, her words spilling out like water from a broken dam. I tried to interject, to steer the conversation in a different direction. "So, how's work going?" I asked, hoping to pivot to something lighter. "Oh, it's fine," she said, brushing the question aside before diving back into her narrative. "Anyway, the last time I saw him at the bank." The mention of the bank became a recurring theme. Apparently, they still crossed paths there, and every encounter seemed to dredge up fresh waves of emotion. I sat there, sipping my coffee, nodding politely as she recounted the details of their arguments, the things he'd said, and the way it had all fallen apart. Minutes turned into an hour, then an hour and a half. Every attempt I made to contribute to the conversation was cut short. If I tried to share a thought or a story of my own, she'd interrupt, turning the focus back to her ex. It was as though she didn't even notice I was there, or worse, that I was just an audience for the drama she needed to unload. By the time I finished my coffee, my patience was wearing thin. I couldn't understand how someone who'd been so engaging over text could be so utterly consumed by her past in person. I'd driven an hour to meet her, expecting connection and chemistry, only to spend the evening playing the silent role in her one-woman show about heartbreak. Finally, the night came to an end. She thanked me for coming and gave me a quick hug before heading to her car. As I drove home, I couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and disappointment. The easy, fun conversations we'd had over text felt like a distant memory, replaced by an evening that had been entirely one-sided. The next day, I got a text from her. For a moment, I thought she might acknowledge how much she'd dominated the conversation, maybe even apologize. Instead, her message was blunt. "You didn't talk much last night. You're too boring to be anything more than just a friend." I stared at my phone, disbelief and irritation bubbling up inside me. After all, I hadn't had a chance to talk, not because I didn't want to, but because she wouldn't let me. I decided to point that out, keeping my tone as calm as I could. "Honestly, it felt like you didn't want me to talk," I replied. "Every time I tried, you brought the conversation back to your ex." Her response came quickly, and it was far from understanding. She grew defensive, claiming she had every right to talk about what was on her mind, and that I should have tried harder to contribute. The more I tried to explain, the more irate she became, twisting the situation into something entirely my fault. It became clear that no amount of reasoning would change her perspective. I ended the conversation and blocked her number, knowing this wasn't worth the energy it was already draining from me. The night was supposed to be straightforward, a classic first date to the movies, simple and low pressure. She'd seemed sweet when we'd talked beforehand, with an easy laugh and just enough shared interests to make me curious about where things could go. I had a good feeling about it, or at least I thought I did. But as I stood outside the theater, waiting for her to arrive, I couldn't shake the odd twinge of anxiety that something wasn't quite right. When she showed up, I was caught off guard. Not because of her, she looked as I expected, cheerful and smiling, but because she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was another woman, a carbon copy of her features, but a few years older. "This is my sister," she announced brightly, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. I managed a polite nod and awkward smile, trying to hide my confusion. Why is her sister here? I wondered. Was this some sort of preemptive chaperone situation? A safety precaution? A last-minute addition to the evening's plans? Whatever the reason, she hadn't mentioned it beforehand, and the sudden presence of a third wheel immediately threw me off balance. Inside the theater, things only got stranger. Before I knew it, I found myself at the ticket counter, paying for both of their tickets. I didn't mind treating my date, it's just part of the ritual, but the added expense of her unexpected guest felt less like a kind gesture and more like an obligation. Still, I brushed it off, convincing myself it wasn't worth making a scene. The movie? Star Wars: The Force Awakens. I'd been excited to see it, being a fan of the franchise, and I thought it would be a safe choice. But as soon as the previews ended and the iconic opening crawl began, it became glaringly obvious that I was the only one in our trio who knew what was happening. "Wait, who's that?" her sister whispered loudly about 5 minutes in. "That's Han Solo," I murmured back, trying to keep my voice low. Who? My date chimed in. I think he's like a space cowboy. I swallowed a sigh. It became a running commentary after that. Questions about characters, confusion over plot points, and occasional giggles about how they had no idea what was going on. The magic of the movie was completely lost on them. What I'd hoped would be a shared experience of cinematic wonder turned into a long, awkward exercise in patience. By the time the credits rolled, I was ready to call it a night. But no, the evening wasn't over yet. Let's grab something to eat, my date suggested as we exited the theater. I didn't have the heart to decline, so I followed them to the nearest McDonald's, where the surreal nature of the date reached its peak. We sat in a booth, the three of us crammed together under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. My date ordered fries and nothing else, and I watched in disbelief as she proceeded to eat them one by one, slow and methodical, like she was counting grains of rice in a bowl. It was mesmerizing in the strangest, most uncomfortable way. Her sister, meanwhile, launched into an uninterrupted monologue about her co-workers. For over an hour, I sat there listening to her dissect every petty grievance and office drama in exhaustive detail. By the end of it, I knew more about her workplace dynamics than I knew about my own, and I hadn't said more than a handful of words the entire time. I kept glancing at my date, hoping for some kind of acknowledgement of how bizarre the situation was. But she seemed completely unfazed, munching on her fries and nodding along to her sister's complaints as though this was the most normal way to spend a first date. When the conversation finally hit a lull, I seized the moment to politely excuse myself. It's getting late, I said, trying to keep my voice light. I should probably head home. They both smiled and thanked me for the evening, and that was that. No lingering goodbye, no suggestion of seeing each other again. As I walked to my car, I felt equal parts bewildered and relieved. What had just happened? Was this supposed to be a date, or had I been roped into some kind of family outing? In the days that followed, I got my answer, sort of. My date didn't text me again, and I certainly didn't reach out to her. The memory of the evening lingered, not because of any heartbreak or regret, but because of the sheer oddness of it all. To this day, I'm still not sure what the purpose of that night was. It all began on a Friday evening. I'd been chatting with this guy for a few weeks, and our conversations flowed effortlessly. We decided it was time to meet in person, so he invited me over to his place for dinner and a movie. Eager to see where this could lead, I agreed. When I arrived, his home was warm and inviting. The aroma of freshly cooked pasta filled the air, and soft music played in the background. We shared stories over dinner, laughter punctuating our conversation. There was an undeniable chemistry between us, a connection that felt both exciting and comforting. As the evening progressed, one thing led to another, and we found ourselves sharing more than just stories. It felt natural, like two pieces of a puzzle fitting together seamlessly. Afterwards, as we lay there catching our breath, he turned to me with a mischievous smile. "Do you want to know what I'm really into?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. Curious and still caught up in the moment, I nodded. "Sure," I replied, expecting perhaps a confession of a favorite movie genre or an unusual hobby. But then he reached out and gently took hold of my foot. A jolt of panic surged through me. An irrational fear gripped my heart. I've always had a deep-seated aversion to anyone touching my feet. Memories of childhood discomfort and a lingering sense of vulnerability flashed through my mind. "I'm sorry, I can't," I stammered, pulling away abruptly. He looked puzzled. "Is everything okay?" But I couldn't find the words. The walls felt like they were closing in, and all I knew was that I needed to get out of there. Grabbing my clothes, I hurriedly dressed, my hands trembling. "I have to go," I managed to say, avoiding his eyes. He tried to protest, but I was already moving towards the door. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I navigated the unfamiliar hallway, searching for the way out. Every door looked the same, and the shadows seemed to stretch ominously. Finally, I stumbled into the living room. Relief washed over me at the sight of the front door, just a few feet away. But before I could reach it, I heard footsteps behind me. "Wait," he called out. I turned briefly, only to see someone else entering the room, a woman. She paused when she saw me, her eyes widening in surprise. There was something familiar about her face, something that tugged at the edges of my memory. And then it hit me. "Dr. Thompson?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She looked equally astonished. "Do I know you?" My cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. "Yes, I'm a former patient of yours." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "Oh, I see. The room spun as the reality of the situation sank in. I had just been intimate with a man whose mother was my old therapist. The same therapist I'd confided in about my deepest fears, including my aversion to anyone touching my feet. "I didn't realize you two knew each other," he said, glancing between us. Neither of us responded. The weight of the awkwardness was almost palpable. I needed to escape, to process this bizarre turn of events somewhere far from here. "I'm sorry, I really have to go," I said, forcing a polite smile. Without waiting for further conversation, I made my way to the door and stepped out into the cool night air. The crisp breeze was a stark contrast to the suffocating tension inside. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I still reeling from a breakup, scrolling aimlessly through Tinder when I matched with her. She was gorgeous, far beyond what I thought I could pull off in my state of disarray. But it wasn't just her looks that hooked me, it was the way she talked. Bold, unfiltered, and dripping with the kind of confidence that made my pulse quicken. Every message was more daring than the last, and before long, she had me hanging on her every word. She made it clear what she wanted, and in my emotional haze, I convinced myself I wanted it too. A few days later, she insisted I come over. The timing was oddly specific, mid-afternoon, on a certain day, no flexibility. Normally, a setup like that would have sent warning bells ringing in my head, but I rationalized it away. This was a Big Ten campus, a busy and bustling place. What could possibly go wrong in the middle of the day with people all around? When I arrived, her place was modest but comfortable, the kind of apartment you'd expect to find near a college campus. She greeted me with a knowing smile, her confidence as magnetic in person as it had been through the screen. I let myself relax, believing for a moment that this was just what I needed. A carefree distraction, something to pull me out of my post-breakup slump. The first half hour went exactly as I'd hoped. We talked, flirted, and the tension between us built steadily. I couldn't believe my luck. For the first time in weeks, the ache in my chest had dulled, replaced by something light and exhilarating. And then the front door opened. At first, I didn't process it. My brain struggled to reconcile the cheerful clatter of keys and the heavy thud of boots with the cozy, private moment we were sharing. But when she froze, her expression shifting from playful to panicked, I knew something was wrong. "Who's that?" I asked, my voice low. She didn't answer. Instead, she jumped to her feet, her composure cracking as she motioned for me to stay quiet. The footsteps grew louder, and then he appeared, a man taller and broader than me, his face a storm cloud of confusion and anger. "Honey, who's this?" he asked, his tone dangerously calm as he gestured toward me. I felt my stomach drop, the pieces clicking together too late. "Wait," I stammered, turning to her. "Is this your husband?" Her silence was answer enough. The air in the room grew thick with tension, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. My fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and I was leaning hard toward flight. "Look, I didn't know," I started, but he cut me off with a sharp glare. "You didn't know," he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Of course you didn't." The realization hit me like a freight train. I wasn't here by accident. She'd planned this. Her specific timing, her insistence that I come over on this particular day, at this particular hour, it wasn't a coincidence. I was a pawn in some twisted revenge plot, a tool she'd used to make him jealous, angry, or who knew what else. "I'm out of here," I said, standing and raising my hands in a gesture of surrender. I wasn't sticking around to find out how this drama unfolded. To my surprise, he didn't try to stop me. He just stood there, staring at her with a mix of hurt and fury that made my chest ache in sympathy. I slipped past him, out the door and into the hallway, my heart pounding as I made my escape. The walk back to my car felt endless. Every step echoed with the realization of how easily I'd been manipulated, how willingly I'd walked into a situation that could have gone so much worse. I couldn't believe I'd been so blind, so desperate for validation that I'd ignored every red flag along the way. When I finally reached my car, I sat behind the wheel for a moment, letting the adrenaline ebb away. The events of the afternoon replayed in my mind, each detail more surreal than the last. I felt a strange mix of relief and anger, relief that I'd gotten out unscathed, and anger at myself for letting it happen in the first place. That day marked the end of my Tinder adventures. The app was deleted before I even pulled out of the parking lot. A new girl I had been talking to on Tinder for a couple of weeks had suggested meeting at Dave & Buster's. I thought it was a great idea. A laid-back place, games to break the ice, and no pressure for an over-the-top fancy dinner. It seemed perfect. I arrived a few minutes early, eager, but not overly nervous. The atmosphere was exactly what I expected, buzzing with laughter, flashing arcade lights, and the occasional hum of excitement from people cheering their victories. When she walked in, she waved with a bright smile that seemed to light up the room. She was every bit as charming in person as she'd been online, and I felt myself relax. This is going to be fun, I thought. She greeted me warmly, and after a brief chat, she led me toward the back of the arcade. I assumed she wanted to start with games, maybe challenge me to a round of air hockey, or see who could rack up the most points at skee-ball. But instead, she guided me past the games, past the bar, and toward a quieter section of the building where a few tables and chairs had been set up. That's odd, I thought, but I followed her without question. She seemed so confident, so sure of where we were headed, that I didn't want to spoil the flow of the date by questioning her plan. As we approached the tables, I noticed something strange. A handful of people were already seated, all of them wearing polite but eager smiles. On one of the tables was a laptop hooked up to a small projector. My heart sank as I realized this wasn't just a spontaneous gathering. This was planned. She gestured for me to take a seat, and before I could even ask what was going on, a man in a crisp button-up shirt stood and began addressing the group. "Welcome, everyone," he said with an enthusiasm that bordered on theatrical. "You're here today because you're ready to take control of your future." I froze. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't a date. This wasn't a fun night out. This was a pyramid scheme recruitment meeting, and I was the unwitting prey. I turned to her, my confusion written all over my face. She smiled apologetically but said nothing, as if this was a perfectly normal thing to spring on someone during a first date. I didn't know whether to laugh, leave, or just sit back and see how far this would go. Against my better judgment, I stayed, partly out of shock and partly out of curiosity. The man clicked through a PowerPoint presentation filled with glossy images of cars, mansions, and vacations, all supposedly attainable by joining this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He spoke about financial freedom, about escaping the rat race, and about how people like me could become millionaires with just a little dedication and hard work. I tried to catch her eye, hoping for some sort of explanation. Was this a joke? A test? But she seemed completely engaged, nodding along as though every word was gospel. I couldn't tell if she genuinely believed in this, or if she was just hoping I'd fall for it too. As the presentation dragged on, I felt trapped. Leaving in the middle would have been obvious and awkward, and I wasn't sure I had the energy for that confrontation. So I did what any polite person would do. I sat there, nodding occasionally, and endured it. Inside, though, I was fuming. After what felt like an eternity, the presentation ended, and the man invited us to sign up on the spot. He even had contracts ready, complete with colorful brochures promising endless wealth. People began milling around, chatting excitedly about their potential futures as self-made millionaires. "Pretty inspiring, right?" she asked, turning to me with a hopeful smile. "Inspiring," I said flatly, trying to mask my disbelief. "Not exactly what I was expecting for tonight." She laughed nervously. "Yeah, I thought it might be a little different, but I wanted to share it with you. Isn't it amazing what they're offering?" I didn't have the heart or the patience to argue with her. "Sure," I muttered, grabbing my jacket. "Thanks for the invite." I left without signing anything, my head spinning as I walked through the arcade. The lights and laughter that had seemed so inviting earlier now felt surreal, like a stage set I'd stumbled onto by accident. A night that was supposed to be simple, uncomplicated, and instead became the most surreal experience of my life. It started a few years ago. I matched with a girl online, and the conversation quickly turned flirty. We weren't looking for anything serious, just a mutual understanding. A one-night connection, no strings attached. As things heated up, we swapped pictures, just enough to make sure we were both on the same page physically. She looked incredible, and her confidence sealed the deal. We set a date, and when the night came, I tidied up my place, double-checked myself in the mirror, and waited for her to arrive. My nerves buzzed slightly, the kind of anticipation that comes before meeting someone new. When her car pulled up outside, I felt a rush of excitement. She knocked on the door, and I opened it with a smile, ready to greet the same confident woman from the photos. But when I saw her, my expression froze. She was very pregnant. Not just starting to show pregnant, no. She was at least 5 months along, her belly unmistakable, a silent but glaring reminder of something she had deliberately not mentioned. My mind scrambled to process what I was seeing. How had I missed this? Why hadn't she said anything? I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. How did you hide that stomach? She didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head, giving me a small, unapologetic smile. You only asked to see my chest and my butt, she said matter-of-factly. You never asked for a full-body picture. Touché. But her nonchalance only added to my confusion and my frustration. I didn't know what to say. There was no rulebook for situations like this. I stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to decide whether I should laugh, yell, or close the door altogether. Her calmness, her casual attitude toward what felt like a massive omission, made the whole thing even more surreal. It wasn't just that she hadn't mentioned her pregnancy. It was the way she acted, as if this were completely normal, as if the details didn't matter because I hadn't explicitly asked. I managed to find my voice. Look, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. This isn't what I expected. Her expression didn't change. You never asked, she replied with a shrug. It was a simple response, but it spoke volumes. She clearly felt no responsibility to disclose anything she didn't think was relevant. And maybe, from her perspective, she was right. But from where I was standing, the situation felt deceptive, like I'd walked into a scenario I hadn't agreed to. I knew then and there that I couldn't go through with it. Not because she was pregnant, that wasn't the issue, but because of how she'd chosen to approach the entire thing. The lack of transparency, the way she seemed to downplay the reality of her situation, made me feel like I was being tested or played. I think we should call it a night, I said finally, stepping back toward the door. She raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. Your call, she said with a shrug, turning to leave. I watched her walk back to her car, a strange mixture of relief and bewilderment settling over me. When she drove away, I closed the door, leaning against it as I let out a long, slow breath. The night had taken such an unexpected turn, and I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how bizarre the entire situation had been. It wasn't about the pregnancy itself. It was about the lack of communication, the way she had sidestepped something so significant as if it were a minor detail. In hindsight, it's almost comical. Almost. At the time, though, it felt like stepping onto a roller coaster I hadn't signed up for, one with sharp turns I couldn't see coming. It taught me a valuable lesson. Always ask more questions. Because sometimes, what you don't know can completely change the story. To this day, I still can't decide if her response was genius or maddening. But one thing is certain, I've never forgotten that night, and I doubt I ever will. What started as a casual meeting at Starbucks turned into a surreal experience that I still replay in my head, wondering if it even really happened. We'd been chatting online for a few weeks, and she seemed nice, funny, flirty, and engaging enough to pique my interest. Her pictures showed a bright smile, an adventurous spirit, and a charm that made me curious to meet her in person. When she suggested I pick her up at a Starbucks near her place, it seemed like a safe and simple plan. The moment I saw her, though, I felt my stomach sink. She looked nothing like her photos. I don't mean slight differences or outdated filters. I mean a complete departure from the person she'd portrayed online. For a brief moment, I considered turning around and leaving, but politeness got the better of me. I told myself, it's just one afternoon. Be nice, hang out for a bit, and then head home. She seemed friendly enough at first, though her energy was a little intense. After grabbing a coffee, she suggested we head to her place. I hesitated but figured it might be less awkward than lingering at Starbucks. How bad could it be? I thought naively. As soon as we stepped into her house, the smell hit me like a wall. It wasn't just a faint odor, it was overwhelming. The air was thick with the unmistakable stench of cat urine, so potent it seemed to seep into my skin with every breath. I tried not to gag, forcing a polite smile as she welcomed me inside. Sorry about the mess, she said breezily, as if the house wasn't saturated with the scent of ammonia. I wasn't expecting company. I nodded stiffly, stepping carefully over piles of clutter as she led me to the living room. Her chihuahua darted out from under a chair, barking furiously. She ignored it at first, motioning for me to sit down, but when the dog wouldn't stop barking, she turned on it with a sudden burst of anger. Shut up, she yelled, smacking the poor thing square on the nose. I froze, horrified. The little dog yelped and scurried away, and she turned back to me as if nothing had happened. So, she said cheerfully, do you want to see my collection? Sure. I replied, unsure what else to say. She walked over to a cabinet and opened it, revealing rows upon rows of colorful, furry tails. At first, I couldn't quite process what I was looking at. Then she held one up, and the realization hit me like a freight train. They were animal tail but plugs. "Pretty cool, huh?" she said, holding a fox tail up to the light as if it were some kind of rare gem. "I've been collecting these for years. Aren't they fun?" I stared, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or run. The absurdity of the situation was almost too much to handle. Here I was, sitting in a house that smelled like a cat shelter gone wrong, being shown an extensive collection of, well, let's just say unconventional accessories. She didn't seem to notice my discomfort. "Anyway," she said, tossing the fox tail back into the cabinet, "do you want to make out on the couch?" The abruptness of her question left me speechless. I glanced at the couch, which was covered in dog hair and who knows what else, and felt a wave of panic. I couldn't stay here. I needed an escape, and I needed it fast. Pulling out my phone, I pretended to read a text. "Oh no," I said, trying to sound convincing. "My grandma, she's not doing well. I need to go." Her face fell, but she nodded. "Oh, that's too bad. I hope she's okay." I mumbled something about checking on her, and practically sprinted to the door. The moment I stepped outside, the fresh air felt like a gift from the heavens. I didn't stop moving until I was in my car, the door locked, and the engine running.